Budget battles continue at the State House, and the governor pushes his turnaround agenda. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Legislature's in session, barreling toward the next fiscal year. People are wondering how it's all going to work with the new Republican governor and the Democratic legislature. Here to help me sort things out for you, a couple of State House smart guys. Charlie Wheeler is back, director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield. Also, before that, a longtime Chicago Sun-Times State House reporter. Charlie, welcome back.
Thank you. It's always good to be here.
Brian Mackey is here, reporter for Illinois Public Radio and Illinois Issues Magazine. Brian, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So the magic number in recent days is $26 million. This was on Good Friday and also the first night of Passover that Governor Rauner's administration issued a freeze on $26 million in grant funding for things including autism and programs and burial of the indigent. And that has caused some consternation, and just in this last week the Senate acted to try to find some money to restore that, but the House is not yet going along. Where are we with this? Charlie.
Well, I think at the moment we're sort of in limbo. The Senate did go ahead, and I believe the vote was, and Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it was something like 57-1 to, in essence, authorize taking $26 million from roughly 150 dedicated funds and put that into the state's checkbook account to cover ostensibly or provide the additional money that would be needed to write the checks to pay for the programs and the spending that Rauner's administration froze. The House isn't ready to go along with it. Part of it is they want to get, I think House Majority Leader Barbara Flynn Curry mentioned something about chapter and verse and exactly what happened to the original bailout package, if you will, how that money was spent, where it was used. And they're not convinced yet that we do need that extra $26 million in the bank account. They think it may already be there, and they just want further clarification. And what would you say, the objectivity of it aside and wanting further details, I think there's also a feeling in the House that they were lied to or misled by the administration. And certainly when House Speaker Michael Madigan presented the original bill, or bills, there were two of them on the House floor, and asked for a vote, he specifically said things like the autism program would not be cut. And then lo and behold, a week or so later, whack, what was it, $4 million got cut from the program.
I think that's the most striking aspect of this, Charlie. And I remember when the speaker got up and did, mental health funding, autism funding. There were several points that he specifically enumerated. And then when those cuts came just a week later, it was pretty surprising. Now, what the administration is going to say is that Tim Newting, the budget chief, who's a very respected guy in the State House, he comes from the Senate Republicans where he's worked for many years doing budget work for them, and he said he felt he was clear with lawmakers that he said, we're going to have to continue looking at cutting these grants, potentially saving money for the state of Illinois, even though this deal is in place. But that does seem to be, like Charlie pointed out, when the speaker specifically says autism funding is safe, you kind of think, okay, this is a man whose word we can take at face value. Autism funding is going to be safe. And then a week later, when that program gets cut for the rest of the year, people were very surprised.
Yeah, now the House had
And I would say the politics of it is, if I'm somebody advising the governor and he says to me, or the budget people come in and say, oh man, we got to cut $26 million more, I think I would say to the governor, fine, go ahead, but whatever you do, don't touch those programs that Madigan referenced on the House floor. Those are sacrosanct. We don't want to get into a situation where we're crosswise with the House Speaker. We're trying to build up trust. We're not trying to leave the impression that we're people that are double dealers.
Well, interesting. And Mr. Newting, Tim Newting, the budget chief for the administration, went before a House committee to look into what's going on with the current year's budget and basically said, I'm sorry that if anyone felt that we weren't straight.
Miscommunicated. He made a point to say, I'm a creature of the Senate, I'm not a creature of the House, but I want to build up trust with you here in the House as well, as he was facing a panel of some very angry lawmakers about, they're hearing from constituents about these programs that people rely on. Another one was the tobacco quit line was something that had to be shuttered, and that's one that's particularly interesting because the governor has proposed funding that in the next budget year. So here's a couple of dozen people who've been laid off now. It's actually done. I was just, WUIS, the radio station where I work, is on the UIS campus. They were actually removing signs on the billboards in the building for the quit line today because it was very quickly that people found out that they weren't going to be employed. But that's something, if it has to start up again in the next fiscal year, you're going to have to rehire all these people who may have moved on, gone to other jobs in the meantime. They're collecting unemployment in the meantime. So there's also questions about how logical some of these cuts are. For, as Charlie made a great point last week, we were talking about this, about such a small amount of money relative to overall state spending. There are a lot of other ways you could have found $26 million, and going after a program that the speaker specifically highlighted would be protected, was an interesting choice.
Yeah, can we be
and I would argue one of the things you could do, the way the state handles its finances, the comptroller's office writes the checks, or produces the warrants, they're called. And that happens overnight. And the data from the agencies, in essence saying, we have this authority to spend the money, and here's how much money we want to spend tonight, comes over late in the afternoon. So if you're looking for $26 million, why not just say take the tape from the Department of Health Care and Family Services for the day's Medicaid payments, and instead of dropping it off at 5 o'clock in the evening, drop it off at 9 o'clock the next morning.
Budget games, we don't like those anymore. Is there anything perhaps Machiavellian about this, that perhaps programs were cut that would raise general alarms, create the newspaper stories they created to somehow, I don't know exactly how, but somehow advantages the governor to show that the cuts are real and that serious
there is a hypothesis out there that if he's willing to cut these, these are programs where you have very aggrieved parents coming in and saying, we rely on these services for our autistic children, and if he's willing to cut this, well, then he's serious and he's somebody not to be trifled with, and he is not afraid of making these unpopular decisions. I mean, that is somewhat how he ran, right? He was going to be the guy to shake up Springfield, and he's certainly doing that.
He talks a lot about, I'm willing to take the arrows. You guys, just vote for the tough stuff, but I'll take the arrows.
Well, there have been governors in the past who proposed budgets making cuts. It's always been in the context, though, of the reason I have to do this. I don't really like to take away money from this program that basically is a lifesaver for some people, but the state doesn't have enough revenues. Therefore, this is what's going to have to be done unless you, the General Assembly, provide more revenue. Jim Thompson did it back in 1983. It led to an income tax increase, temporary. And he had a lot of the same kind of, not autism, but similar programs that were on the chopping block. And he said, if we don't increase our revenues, these programs are going to be cut. And it was used as a ploy to, in essence, create additional revenue to sustain the programs. Now, what Governor Rauner has said he wants to do is he wants to leverage these programs against his so-called turnaround agenda. All of this anti-union stuff that has this, what would you say, this
Well, Michael Kerrigan, who is the head of the AFL-CIO, used the word obsession.
Yeah, he's
and
maniacal about it.
And of course, Governor Rauner says he's not anti-union, but he's anti-conflict of interest with government unions, et cetera, et cetera.
That's just so much.
Electing politicians and then getting contracts with
right,
them.
But it's okay for a handful of guys who are multimillionaires, near billionaires, to put together a $25 million slush fund to oppose lawmakers who don't go along with Rauner and to support those who do. That's no conflict there, of course. But to get back to the point, Rauner is holding, for example, kids with autism, he's holding them hostage for this turnaround agenda. We've never had a governor do that kind of thing before.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. I was a witness to a couple of the governor's speeches in the last week. One was the Citizens Club of Springfield, the Hoagland Center in the morning, and he basically laid out, it's the special interest, and when he talks special interest, he's almost always talking about unions, particularly public sector unions, and he is making this claim. And then he also talked to bankers, telling them, talk to your local newspaper, get on the radio, tell your local governmental units to pass these resolutions that my administration has recommended, saying that we should be able to have right-to-work zones. He calls them, I think, employee empowerment zones, because he says
to
that
empower employers to pay their workers less money.
Well, and that would certainly be what we hear from the union.
And I've said it before, and I will lay out my conflict of interest, if you will. I'm a lifetime member of the Chicago Newspaper Guild, proud to be one, and I'm also a member of the new union that we've created at the university. So yeah, I'm a union supporter, and my basic reason is I think unions historically have provided a means for working class people to increase their economic potential and to join and rise in the middle class. And as unions have gone down, the middle class has been carved out. So
well, it's interesting. And at one of these events this week, the governor just mentioned to the Citizens Club at the Hoagland Center in Springfield, he is trying to take away, he calls them unfair share dues, and unions call them fair share. So if you don't want to join a union, and he keeps saying people are forced to join unions, they're actually not in Illinois.
Mm-hmm. Well, if there can be closed shops, though. I think. I don't think anymore, but I'm not sure.
Well,
we'll fact check that for next week.
We will. but if you are in a union shop and you don't want to join, and it's certainly that way in state government, you are assessed a fair share dues, which pays for the bargaining that gets you your raise and gets you your representation if you get in trouble with the boss or something. And the governor has tried to just stop that, and he has not yet been successful, but he's in court trying to get that done. And he mentioned that he wants teachers who don't want to join unions to not have to pay fair share dues either, which would expand it to governments all over the state. He did not elaborate afterwards, but that's because partly he had said he wasn't going to have an availability after that speech, which happens a lot.
Well, this is a well-worn tactic that we've seen implemented across the country to try and weaken unions, and you can't really escape the fact that one of the things that seems to be driving the national movement here is that unions typically support Democrats. They are still a very significant source of funding for Democrats, and so I don't think the governor can talk about increasing the Illinois economy and giving workers more rights, but one of the things that underlies these movements nationally is that it is a way to try and undermine a big source of funding for Democrats, and I don't think that should be ignored.
Right. And the governor argues that there are many companies that won't come to Illinois unless we have some of these right-to-work zones. But obviously other people say Illinois is doing okay in some ways, but many people, whatever, it's part of the argument. So we will see where it goes. One of the things the governor talks about, it seems more and more, and I don't know if the legislature will go along with this, but is bankruptcy. He talks about restructuring of government, particularly with Chicago Public Schools, who they have a lot of pension obligations that are going to burden them greatly shortly and already are, but some other governments as well. And I think he wants local governments to be able to declare bankruptcy. When he was at the State Journal-Register's editorial board, he mentioned that. Brian, I think you have done some work on this issue, and is this a common, I don't know how common this is or if the legislature would go for that.
Yeah, well, State Representative Ron Sandak, who is a Republican from Downers Grove, he's kind of emerged as one of Governor Rauner's biggest supporters and kind of really attack dogs in the legislature. He speaks out very vociferously in favor of the governor's policies, and he's become kind of, people remember State Representative Mike Bost used to have the role where he'd stand up, or not, sort of throw a fit on every bill as kind of the token opposition if it has to happen, even if nobody else is going to speak. He kind of does that a lot now. But he is carrying this legislation. He's also a former mayor, and he says that one of the things that this could do is give mayors more power to bargain with their unions, right? If they have just the threat of bankruptcy and they want to try and get some concessions out of their local firefighters union or police officers union or something like that, that being able to say, you know what, we're in a financial crisis in this town, and if you don't agree to these salary reductions or pension reductions or whatever it would be, then we might have to declare bankruptcy. And if that happens, all bets are off, right? Then you have to, the creditors get decided by a court.
And that would include pensioners, wouldn't it? Or what?
Presumably, yeah. I mean, this is a different type of bankruptcy. You're not going to liquidate a municipality and sell the fire trucks and salt trucks for cash on the dollar or scrap metal. It's a different chapter of the federal bankruptcy code. But the idea is, at heart, this is about leverage and giving municipal governments more leverage, they say, to bargain with their unions. And this fits very neatly into, as we talked about, the governor's talking point or message about how he thinks that government unions have too much power and that the relationship has become lopsided between government unions and government.
Well, interestingly, I mean, this turnaround agenda includes that. It includes lower unemployment insurance costs, lower workers' compensation costs, and maybe changing the rules. And he talks about tort reform, which is the court system, trying to put some apparently limits on damages, or venue shopping, so that you can't.
There are a couple of different things with that.
Yeah. So especially with the right to work stuff, and I recently kind of recalled in a column that in 1981, the biggest rally I ever saw at the State House, thousands and thousands of people, when Jim Thompson was governor in 1981, he promised as a Republican governor, I'll never let right to work happen in Illinois. He was also saying he would veto any anti-union bill, so things have changed a lot over
It was
this period of
Republican
time.
governors who allowed collective bargaining formally in state government.
Right. But what's interesting about what Governor Rauner is doing in all of these issues, he is using as models people like former and current governors of Indiana and Wisconsin, but they have Republican legislatures and we have a Democratic one. So can he get any of this done, I guess, is the question.
No, he can't get any. All this anti-union stuff, that's not going to happen. And I think it would be a lot more productive for the governor were he to focus in on the things where there has been movement in the past and where there are areas for compromise. Workers' compensation, for example, would be one. Unemployment insurance might be another. Changing the civil justice system regarding venue shopping, those kinds of things might be doable. But right to work isn't. So, as I say, he's got this fixation, and it is an obsession. And I guess it comes from coming from an environment where the unions were the enemy because they stood in the way of the money guys who come in and buy the company, want to lay people off, want to cut wages, and there's a union contract, so they can't do it.
I do think there's one tactic the governor is trying that could eventually show some success, possibly years down the line, and that's he's filed some lawsuits, federal cases, where he's going after this collective bargaining in state government and these fair share fees that we talked about earlier, where you don't have to join the union, but you're still assessed a smaller, somewhat smaller than the dues you would pay otherwise for the services of wages and grievances and things like that. And he has filed some federal cases, and if those were to ever work their way up to the United States Supreme Court, I don't think it's inconceivable, especially given the decision we had a year ago about home health care workers in Illinois. The U.S. Supreme Court at that time, let them off. That was a very narrow case. It was a very narrow type of...
Because they were not state workers, but
right.
they were getting state.
These are not like state
workers.
troopers you would think of, or prison guards or someone like that. But I do think that, maybe, one thing the governor in his wildest dreams would hope for is that this case would eventually get to the U.S. Supreme Court, and a very conservative Justice Scalia or Clarence Thomas or somebody like that would write an opinion that somehow really struck a blow to collective bargaining for government workers.
The last time this issue was before the High Court, it was a narrow decision. It was 5-4 to uphold fair share, and that's been the controlling precedent. And that was a number of years ago. What was it?
It was 1970s, is that right?
No,
or
it was
80s?
later than that, but it's been a long time. It's called the Abood decision, and there's a case coming out of California also that's challenging this notion of fair share, and Rauner's trying to tag along on that and do away with it as a way to weaken unions.
We'll see where it goes. Marijuana is one of those issues that continues, is really in flux nationally, and the fact that Illinois, it's not being sold yet, but the process is set up to sell marijuana for medical purposes in dispensaries around the state. Anita Alvarez just this week, who is the state's attorney in Cook County, said that for low-level possession of marijuana, she's not going to have her people prosecute. They're just going to try to put people in drug programs. And the Illinois House voted with 62 votes for, I think it's 15 grams or less, to treat it like a traffic ticket. It's really a big trend because there was so much in the prison building in Illinois and the anti-drug movement. Where are we going with these things?
Well, I would say that we're moving in a direction where we're going to treat marijuana not as being a dangerous drug like heroin or opium or something like that, but rather as kind of a minor nuisance, kind of like alcohol. Not that alcoholism isn't a major problem. And the difficulty is that we spend an awful lot of money. I forget the numbers out of Cook County, but there's a significant amount of time spent by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office attempting to prosecute these low-level marijuana possession charges, which almost uniformly get thrown out by the judges. But a lot of these people wind up staying in the Cook County Jail overnight, and it costs something like $150 a night per person, and there's tens of thousands of them, so the bill really mounts, and it just makes sense. And it's interesting to me because there's kind of a confluence of some of the drug warriors who also are fiscal conservatives are now starting to think about the monetary aspect of locking everybody up forever. And the people who are, what would you say, drug warriors in the sense of being advocates have always felt that you shouldn't treat marijuana as though it were the same as some of these really, really dangerous drugs.
We'll see where that goes, because it does look like Illinois has joined that trend for monetary and other reasons.
Yeah, and I don't know if you wanted to talk about medical marijuana. The House did pass legislation this week about
the extending
the
trial
pilot.
period.
So the pilot program was supposed to be a 4-year program for medical marijuana in Illinois, and it took so long to get the regulatory framework approved, and there are different. One company would grow it, then you'd have dispensaries, which are different companies, and there was a lot of lobbying, and there were questions raised about which companies were going to get those contracts. And so it's taken, it's almost 2 years now since that passed, and not a single gram of cannabis has been dispensed to anyone.
Right.
And so what...
Legally,
fair enough. Well, and that's the concern. So State Representative Lou Lang said, he's the big sponsor of this legislation, he said if you only have 2 years, and these companies have already invested millions of dollars in setting up these growing centers and things like that, they're going to raise prices, and it's going to drive people right to the black market where they might be getting marijuana currently. And so in order to have, allow these companies to recoup their investments and really give a proper trial period, you would need a 4-year program. So the House voted to extend it. The governor has indicated he was not necessarily willing to go along with that in the past, but passage in the House, there were a lot of Republicans who did go along with that legislation, so it may be an indication that it's now going to move forward. We'll just have to wait and see.
The 4 years would begin when they actually start operations in the dispensaries?
I don't actually recall the exact date.
Yeah, I think it's that, but it would probably extend it about 2 years, so that make up for the time that's been lost in just setting up the program. So we will see where that one goes. I wanted to mention, just on the federal side, we do have Aaron Schock, the former congressman from Peoria, who represented part of Springfield, and I think there's 19 counties, all or partly in the 18th congressional district. The people on the ballot are now set, unless they're challenged off, but Darren LaHood is the state senator from the Peoria area, a son of Ray LaHood. He's one of the Republican candidates, a guy named Mike Flynn, who has been, he lives in Quincy, but he's only just moved back. He's been in Washington for years and works for a conservative website run Breitbart.com, I believe. A guy named Donald Rientz, R-I-E-N-T-S, who is of Benson, a rural guy just interested in getting there. Darren LaHood seems to be getting most of the attention, certainly from the establishment Republicans. And on the Democratic side, a school board member from Springfield named Adam Lopez, and Rob Mellon of Quincy, who is a teacher, who had tried to run before in the primary when Aaron Schock was still in, but it's an overwhelmingly Republican district, so I guess there is a July 7th primary on each side and a September 10th special election just to fill out Aaron Schock's current term, and then we'll start all over again.
Yeah.
So
one of the things I find interesting about this, not necessarily that there's going to be a huge competition and it's going to be a heated campaign or anything like that, the fact that some of the counties that are having to hold this special election at great cost are passing resolutions saying that Aaron Schock's campaign fund should help defray the costs of the special election that he's caused.
Right. Well, he's got...
I think somebody sued to do that too, didn't they? There was a suit filed?
There was a suit filed by a $500 contributor from Chicago who said he wants his money back just from the fund. Now, Aaron Schock, his combined campaign funds, I think, had about $3 million, but the way lawyers cost these days...
I was going to say,
and I think he can use these funds for his legal fees. A lot of that might end up getting used, so we'll see where that goes. We've also, there is a continuing movement to, and some legislation has been introduced to make the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum in Springfield its own agency and roll the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, which oversees historic sites across the state, into the Department of Commerce. The governor seems to like it. Mike Madigan, the House Speaker, seems to like it. The board of the Historic Preservation Agency doesn't like it, and they say you won't save the money that they're promising. But with the confluence of people who are for it, that looks like it's probably going to happen, doesn't it? Or where are we on that?
I would guess that probably will go. And I think in the larger scheme of things, it shows that when there are interests that converge, Madigan and Rauner can work very well together. Mike Madigan has wanted to have the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum and Library standalone for some time. He introduced legislation last session to do it that ultimately didn't, I think it went through the House, died in the Senate. And now with the governor on board, and what the governor gets out of it is the ability to have this public-private partnership to spur economic development in Illinois.
Yeah. Which I guess, well, there must be models other places. We'll see how that works.
Well, the idea, I think, what some of you mentioned that the historic preservation people are opposed to this, that is an agency that has really suffered in the past, 10, 15 years. We've seen long periods where sites have been closed altogether or only open 1 or 2 days a week, going back to Governor Blagojevich's tenure.
Yeah.
And I think their concern is that by moving it into commerce and making it more of a tourism agency, you're losing the sort of historian perspective, right? They view it as we're preserving Illinois' heritage, Illinois' history with some of these old farms, old homes, the old state capitol here in Springfield, and now it's going to be leveraged for marketing and tourism purposes. Will you lose the unique historic care that they might bring to this?
Well, that's one of the things that I'm sure we'll continue to hear debated. Before we take off, because we're just about out of time, I should say the Senate passed a bill that would make sweet corn the state vegetable, although there was some discussion as to if it's really a vegetable, but a Chatham, fourth graders at a Chatham Elementary School had proposed this, and Senator Sam McCann carried it. So good things can happen in the legislature. With that, Charlie Wheeler, Brian Mackey, thanks for sharing this half hour with us. Thank you. This is Bernie Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.